Good evening, everybody. I hope your Wednesday has been treating you well. I definitely hope you've enjoyed the last couple of days. We've got I don't want to say a break from the heat, but a little bit of one, as it has been gorgeous outside, and I've been trying to spend some time outside with the kids, and it's just, it makes for a wonderful and glorious evening. But nevertheless, I hope you are enjoying it. And tonight, as we dive off into Daniel chapter 6, we're going to be looking at the first 9 verses of chapter 6 as it relates to we're officially into the transition now of where Darius is the new king, that is, of the Medes and the Persians. The Babylonians are officially done and over with in terms of chapter 6, and we've already moved on from that statue of gold at the head to the silver for the breastplate in the central region. And so with that being the case, we're kind of moving on through just the realities of what history looks like. And so tonight, as we looking into Daniel chapter 6, we'll begin in verse 1 there, and I'll get it pulled up on the screen for you. It says, Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. And Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. But in verse 4 it says, the administrators and satraps therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was, and I love this, trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. So in verse 6 they say, so the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, may King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, the advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document, so that as a law of the Medes and the Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the document. So going back up, we're going to kind of break it down into 2 sections here, verses 1 through 5 and then verses 6 through 9. But as we dive off into verses 1 through 5, just a couple of things to point out for you here. Of course, Darius's reign began in 522 BC, so we talked a little bit about that last week in terms of that Belshazzar losing the kingdom from the Babylonian side of it, and then, of course, Darius stepping in to officially claim the throne and, transition the kingdoms from the Babylonians to the Medes and the Persians. But one of the first things that Darius does, he appoints 120 satraps over the area. So this is kind of a new way of reigning within the world at the time. But nevertheless, satrap means protector of the kingdom here. So in essence, this is what Darius is doing, is he is dividing and conquering, so to speak. He is delegating out work to various people. If you're in any type of leadership position, delegation is a wonderful and beautiful thing if it is done correctly. It's not to micromanage, but hopefully there is trust that is built into those positions that allows it to relieve some of the common everyday stressors of life. But nevertheless, there is some debate that goes into it, how many provinces and areas went into all these different things is definitely part of that discussion. But nevertheless, that is what verse 1 begins to depict for us. But it talks about in verse 2 there, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. So as Daniel is appointed as one of the administrators, his responsibility would have been to make sure that all the taxes had been collected and to keep check on the satraps to make sure that they were not stealing or abusing their power. So kind of checks and balances, rules of regulation, so to speak. It is unclear exactly how Darius knew about Daniel, but given the reputation of Daniel, it seems that Darius had heard of Daniel maybe through the writing on the wall or another display he made of wisdom. So, there again, keep in mind, Daniel is roughly 85 years old at this point. I mean, he's no spring chicken. I mean, he has had a long, healthy, and I would say a good and great life because of his not only relationship with God, but his willingness to stand up for God throughout the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus and Belshazzar and the other rulers. I mean, Daniel had clearly left his mark on history, as we're talking about even today, because of his faith towards God. And so, of course, we may not realize or understand how all this came to be, but either way, it had to come from somewhere. Darius had been made aware in some shape, form, or fashion about who exactly Daniel was and said, hey, I want this guy on my team, because whenever he's around, good things happen. So just because Daniel's around doesn't mean that it's just going to go well. It's not like he's a lucky charm or, that kind of thing. But still, that's kind of a mentality that flows. But as we think about the molding and the shaping of the kingdom at this point, Darius actually kind of sets up and structure kind of what the Romans would later follow as we think about the Roman Empire. Whenever you think in terms of the intertestamental period, you actually see in the Roman period of the empire that they actually divide up the land into four quadrants. Basically, it was known as the Dia Decoi, if you're familiar with that term, but nevertheless, it was four different regions that they had broke or divided the empire into at that point, and then from there, kind of top-down structure began to divide out and conquer and delegate out into the region. And so it's definitely something that worked well in this time, and I would say still works well for many governments even today. But regardless of the manner in which the king knew Daniel, it is to be said that Darius was extremely impressed by Daniel. Do not forget that side of it. I love how it says in verses 3 and 4, Daniel had a distinguished spirit, which basically is talking about it was an exceptional spirit, or an exceptional spirit was in him. The way he conducted himself, his character, his mannerisms, his wording, and all the things that he used to compile himself in those moments. I mean, it's something that quickly became aware and or known to Darius and then lived out even in those moments. And so I love that. And of course we know an exceptional spirit that is directly related to God, even though he may not have acknowledged that, we are aware of what exactly that side of it looks like. But nevertheless, as it talks about there, the spirit may refer to his good nature, his attitude, but possibly that the king recognized that Daniel was in touch with the gods and this possessed great wisdom. So naturally, Daniel carries on in his legacy of following God. But in terms of verses 4 and 5, notice that the two other governors become involved in this, plus a few satraps. What do? They begin to conspire and devise a plan. What does it talk about? The administrators and the satraps there in verse 4, therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. Whatever Daniel did, he clearly rubbed them the wrong way. Maybe they were all sitting around gossiping and Daniel said, nope, I don't want any part of it. Or maybe they were trying to do something unethical and Daniel said, that's ridiculous, we don't need to do that. We don't really know what exactly kind of led up to this moment, other than there was a clear distinction between them and Daniel, that he did not operate and he did not function as the rest of them did. And so as it talks about at the end of verse 4, they could not find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found within him. And these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. So of course, all of these things are, leading up to this side of just, of course, pointing towards Daniel in the lion's den as the rest of chapter 6 goes, that you're, I would imagine, pretty aware of and everything. But the biggest aspect, when they examined Daniel, they were not able to find any flaws. There was no immediate red flags. There was no potential of blackmail. Of course, that would have definitely been a huge part of this of, well, unless you do this, we're going to tell people about what you've done over here or this or that. There was no, side of that. As it says, there was no charge. He was faithful, which, means trustworthy. There was no error or corruption. He wasn't dishonest, in terms of they couldn't find any fault. He was not negligent to any part of his duties. There again, in the common world, it was not an uncommon idea to find or think that these satraps could have been pocketing some of this tax money or this or that. I mean, there again, a lot of unethical, more than likely potential things were going on right now in this moment. And imagine that from their standpoint. Here it is, you may be pocketing a couple of things, and maybe Daniel saw it. Maybe Daniel went and addressed it. And now they're saying, man, if we don't get rid of this Daniel, what if he tells on us? I could be hung. I could be killed and beheaded. There's a lot that begins to, of course, kind of weigh itself out in the balances here. But still, they're trying to do something, in essence, to accuse or kind of put Daniel on the same playing field. Hey, you may think you're up here, but you did this. You're right here with the rest of us. And thankfully, they couldn't do it, which is a beautiful thing because that was the character, that was the conduct of Daniel that ultimately helped out in this situation and these circumstances. When these officials discovered that Daniel was clean, they resorted to one last measure of attack, and that was Daniel's religion, the law of his God. The officials hoped there might be something in Daniel's faith that would expose his true nature. There again, they're, I don't want to say familiar with God, but they're definitely, looking at Daniel from a very physical sense in terms of it's just the here and now. They're not thinking beyond the scope of real gods or who exactly Daniel is serving, basically. They're thinking in a very temporal sense right now as to how exactly his relationship with the gods or whatever they're thinking through, how they can influence that and manipulate that and corrupt it. And so there again, I love the character of Daniel at this moment, even that it's all above board, it's all above reproach. But as we go into verses 6 and 9, we go back to verse 6. So the administrators and the satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." A common way of announcing themselves before the king. But he said, "All the administrators of the kingdom and prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den." So going down and thinking about what exactly is transpiring and happening right here, notice what happens with the officials. They band together in a frenzy and hype themselves up to go before the king. When as a group, or it talks about in the New King James, a throng, which basically actually symbolizes maybe mob characteristics. I mean, they begin to gather. They begin to, hey, do you agree with this? Do you agree with that? Oh, you all over there agree? Okay, so there's like 30 of us. Let's go before the king and let's pin his hide to the wall. Let's do something about Daniel so that way all these underhanded things we do, we don't have to worry about somebody snitching on us or telling, the king about what's going on and tattling and there again, all these things. It is being worked up out of, more than likely, their own unethical behavior and trying not to get caught. But nevertheless, I asked the question there at the bottom, does this sound familiar? Isn't that what Jesus went through? I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels here. I mean, obviously it's not the same, but I mean, you see what I'm trying to say? I mean, Jesus literally was condemned as a good man who was, of course, the Son of God. There was nothing but good within him. He was innocent, and yet he was put on trial and convicted for claiming to be the Son of God, which he was. Of course, all of it begins to come, true. The people begin to see. They connect the dots. There's things that begin to happen, all these things. But still yet, in those moments, what did the Pharisees work themselves into? Kind of a frenzy of trying to get Herod to crucify Jesus. So there again, just an interesting connection. I thought maybe it was worth a discussion there, but nevertheless, the problem is they claim all officials are alike in their agreement. Does that not sound disastrous right there? If you've got, we'll say 30 people coming together with a definite decision, it's going to say with no qualms or issues whatsoever, it's going to throw up a red flag in my mind. You know, in any room, if you have 10 people in the room, you're going to have 50 different opinions. I mean, no matter what you do, I mean, there again, the writing's on the wall, the red flag's going up, hold up, something ain't right. But the terms of their agreement that anyone who prays specifically to any god is going to be condemned. You know, the decree is to talk of the priests, that people would make petitions normally through them, but now they must all be channeled through Darius. So they're basically, Darius, we're going to put you in the spotlight. We're going to send everybody to you, and we're going to, build you up. I mean, you're going to be put on this pedestal, like Nebuchadnezzar had. We're going to build a statue of you, and just, filling his mind and his heart full of exultation and, just boasting, basically. There again, we've seen it already in Daniel's, 1 through 5 in terms of what happens whenever pride is getting into the mix. But nevertheless, here, the point was not that to state that Darius is a god, but that he was the new mediator for the gods. If you didn't use him, you were out of line. So it gave, in essence, control over to Darius in order to make decisions whether gods okayed it or not. Of course, they're false, they're not real, but nevertheless, you see what I'm saying? It would give him the authority to do whatever he wanted to do. And so anyone who didn't follow this decree would be cast into the lion's den. And so research shows that this was a gruesome fate that occurred quite a bit during this time, and the den itself would have been either a man-made or natural pit in the ground where people would be tossed into it at that point. So naturally, you're seeing everything begin to unfold, and as it begins to lead up to those moments, they were to do this in a hurry before the king could change his mind. According to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, once a decree was set, there was no way to alter it. It was set in stone, couldn't go back on it. Of course, we later see this on into chapter 6, whenever Darius is more or less pacing and going all night while Daniel's in the lion's den, because of the fact that he knew he had messed up. And so either way, you would think Darius would have thought this through, but on the other hand, he was probably so excited to see this happen and receive the recognition from it, he probably didn't care. It was just, oh yeah, this sounds great, put his name on it, and that was the end of it. So one report claims that there was a man put to death under Darius III, even though he was known to be perfectly innocent. Darius III immediately repented and blamed himself for having committed such a great error, but it was impossible to have undone what he had done by royal authority. So our word means everything to us, and if there's anything that I don't want to say I commend them for, but it's that side of it of saying that, if their word meant something to them as far as that goes. If I say this is what is going to happen, even if it's wrong, which I don't agree with on that side, obviously, but, there's definitely a strong emphasis on that side of once this is talked about, once the decision is made, that's it. It's done, it's over, it's finalized, and it can't be undone, it can't be changed. And so, naturally, you see that transition on into Daniel whenever he gets into the lion's den, the king pacing, and being up all night and everything else. But as a point of application, as we wrap everything up this evening, here's just a couple of things I would encourage you with. If you have an issue, talk to the individual, not everyone else. That is probably one of the worst things we do as human beings, is that instead of going back to an individual who's wronged us, or maybe even we've wronged them, whatever the case, we talk about it with 10 other people before we ever go to that or go back to that person. Or we are over here, we use a middleman to go, we talk to them, and then they go try to talk to the individual themselves. I'm not saying a mediator is a bad thing, but still, Jesus laid out in Matthew 18 a principle for being able to deal with such issues. And what did he say? Hey, go talk to your brother. Go talk to your sister one-on-one. Don't use other people. Don't gossip about it. Don't, stir drama out of it. But go to them. What would have happened if they would have went to Daniel and just sat down and tried to hash it out and have a conversation? Who knows? But either way, we know Daniel was an upstanding citizen. He was a godly man. I mean, he'd have probably still told them, like, hey, cut this out or you don't have to worry about me. The option's pretty clear. It's your choice. I mean, you want to do wrong? Suffer the consequences. But either way, if you have an issue, if you have a problem, go to the person, not everyone else. But lastly, Daniel was not a closet Christian even at 85. Are you? Whenever I think about Daniel, even at 85, he could have easily, I don't want to say decline the position as far as being a governor over the land. That's not necessarily something you want to do, is look at the king and say, no, I'm not interested. And so Daniel was still kind of playing into the political side of things in that arena of, okay, I've got to keep up, go along to get along kind of thing, But there was still this unquestionable, irrevocable point out of his life of being able to say, there's no way I can ever go back on what I've done or, how I've lived my life for God. God has been there for me for all of it rather than anybody else. I mean, in Daniel's mind, there was a clear understanding of why he was going to make the decisions that he had already made, plus on into the future, as in the next week's passage as we get into Daniel and the lion's den. But either way, he didn't just live his life in a box of just, I'm a Christian, but nobody knows it. Far too many times today, if we were to go around and ask people that we work with or that we're friends with, hey, do you know that I'm a believer? If they were to look and say, no, I didn't know that, I would be extremely concerned if I were you. I want people to know I'm a believer. I want people to know I'm a Christian. It's not about always just wearing a shirt that has a Bible verse on it. It's not about wearing a necklace with the cross on it or this or that. I mean, it's about literal conversations, because there's ungodly people that wear crosses around their necks. There are ungodly people that have Bible verses tattooed all over them or wearing shirts or this or that. But what it where the rubber meets the road is that our actions, they don't align with what the pastor said or this. Our actions align with God and His Word. That is the true distinction within it all. And the heart and the motivation behind every believer would be what I would say. But nevertheless, hopefully you're not a closet Christian and you're willing to be somebody like Daniel was to Darius, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, you name it. But nevertheless, I hope this gives you something to think about. But next week we'll get into the rest of chapter 6 and thinking through about Daniel and the lion's den. But apart from that, I hope you all have a great and wonderful rest of your week. If you need anything, please let me know. But on the other side of that, I hope continue to pray for those that we have on our prayer request list that went out earlier today or will in the morning. But nevertheless, either way, continue to pray for those. But otherwise, we'll see y'all next week, and I guess we'll go from there. Thank you, guys.